The Roman Empire, vast and unyielding, forged its identity upon power, conquest, and divine order. Yet within its golden age, it bore rulers who embodied not only the glory of Rome but also its deepest descent into darkness. Among them, none is remembered with such infamy as Caligula, the emperor whose reign promised brilliance but collapsed into madness. His story is not merely history, it is a cautionary tale of power unchained, of a man who rose like a star and burned out in the blaze of his own excess. In the year 12 AD, a child was born into the shadow of Rome's greatness, Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. He was no ordinary child, for his lineage tied him directly to the blood of emperors and the ambition of generals. His father, Germanicus, was the pride of Rome's armies, a man so beloved by his legions that they whispered he might one day inherit the empire itself. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, was the granddaughter of Augustus, fierce in spirit and unyielding in her will. From the moment of his birth, this child was marked by destiny, yet surrounded by danger. Unlike children raised in marble halls and golden palaces, Gaius's early world was the military camp. Along the northern frontiers, where icy winds cut through the forests and the Rhine roared like a living beast, he walked among soldiers hardened by war. And yet, this boy, barely tall enough to reach their knees, became their joy. The legionaries dressed him in a miniature soldier's tunic, slipped tiny sandals, Caligula, onto his feet, and laughed with pride as he marched through the camp as though he commanded an army of his own. It was in those days that he earned a name that would never leave him, Caligula, Little Boots. To the soldiers, it was a term of affection, a symbol of their loyalty to his father and their love for the child who brought them laughter in the smoke of battle. But history is rarely kind to names. What began as a playful gesture would one day cling to him like a cruel irony. For the boy who once strutted through camp in toy armor would grow into an emperor cloaked in blood and fear, a man whose very guards would quake at his presence. Thus began the story of Caligula. Born in innocence among soldiers, carried forward by destiny, and fated to become one of the most infamous rulers the world has ever known. The destiny of Caligula was written not only in glory but in blood. His father, Germanicus, stood as Rome's shining hope, a general adored by the people, worshipped by the legions, and seen by many as the rightful heir to rule after Augustus. Yet such brilliance could not escape the shadows of imperial jealousy. In 19 AD, while commanding in the east, Germanicus died under suspicious circumstances in Syria. To the grieving legions it was no natural death. Whispers spread like wildfire through the empire, poison. And behind the rumor stood one name, Tiberius, the reigning emperor, threatened by the popularity of his young rival. Caligula's mother, Agrippina the Elder, refused silence. Proud and fiery, she accused the emperor himself of murder. Rome's ruler responded not with words but with chains. Agrippina was exiled, her spirit broken under the weight of imperial wrath. Caligula's brothers fared no better. Imprisoned, starved, or struck down, their names erased from Rome's future. By the time Caligula reached his late teens, the golden promise of his family had been shattered. Germanicus, the hero of the legions, lay in a tomb. His mother, the proud granddaughter of Augustus, languished in exile. His brothers, once heirs of destiny, were corpses or prisoners. Caligula alone remained. But survival was no gift of mercy. Tiberius was too cunning, too paranoid to leave the boy unguarded. Instead, he drew Caligula into his lair, the island palace of Capri, where the emperor hid himself among debauchery, cruelty, and suspicion. There, in a court steeped in corruption and terror, the young Caligula learned the art of survival. He did not resist. He did not rebel. He watched. He obeyed. He wore the mask of silence while his heart smoldered in secret. It was here that the foundations of his character were laid. Outwardly, he became the quiet, dutiful heir. Inwardly, he was being forged by fire, shaped not by innocence but by betrayal, fear, and resentment. The boy who had once marched in little boots now walked among wolves, learning the language of power in whispers, daggers, and poisoned cups. In 37 AD, the long and shadowed reign of Tiberius came to an end. His death opened a void in Rome, and into that void stepped a young man of only 24 years, Gaius Caligula. To the weary empire, his very name was a promise. He was not merely the heir. He was the son of Germanicus, the fallen hero whose memory still lived in the hearts of soldiers and citizens alike. He was the child who had endured the slaughter of his family, the survivor of imperial suspicion, the last flame of a house that had been nearly extinguished. When news spread that Caligula had been named emperor, Rome erupted in joy. The Senate, eager to forget the cruelty of Tiberius, bowed before him as the rightful heir of Augustus. The Praetorian Guard, sworn to protect him, hailed him with thunderous acclamation. And the people, those who remembered Germanicus's loyalty and kindness, poured into the streets as though chains had been broken. To them, Caligula was not only a ruler but a liberator. At first he justified their faith. His early reign was a season of mercy and generosity. He ended the dreaded treason trials that had choked Rome under Tiberius. He welcomed back exiles who had long languished in distant provinces. He opened the prisons, restored confiscated property, and proclaimed amnesty where there had once been fear. Rome, for the first time in years, breathed freely. But Caligula gave more than mercy, he gave spectacle. He filled the amphitheaters with games, festivals, and lavish entertainments. Gold and food were showered upon the people, and charity flowed as though the empire's wealth were without end. In every gesture, he sought not just to rule but to win the hearts of those who had crowned him with hope. Above all, he honored his blood. The ashes of his murdered family, once scattered in exile, were brought home with solemn dignity. He declared their memory sacred, lifting them into the light of Roman reverence. In doing so, he bound his own rule to theirs, presenting himself as the rightful continuation of a legacy nearly destroyed. For a brief, dazzling moment, it seemed that Rome had at last found what it had long yearned for, not merely an emperor but a savior. The city, accustomed to fear, now tasted hope. The empire, weary of suspicion, now dreamed of renewal. Caligula had risen, and all of Rome rose with him, unaware that the light they embraced was already burning toward madness. The golden dawn of Caligula's reign was brief, and its light soon fractured into darkness. Only months after the Senate had crowned him, after the people had lifted him as their savior, the young emperor was struck by a sudden and terrible illness. Whether it was fever, poison, or the long shadow of a mind already scarred by years of fear and grief, none could say. For weeks he lingered on the edge of death, Rome holding its breath as prayers and sacrifices rose from every quarter of the empire. He survived. But the man who rose from his sickbed was not the same as the one who had fallen into it. Something had broken within him. The smile that had once charmed the people was gone, replaced by a gaze fevered with delirium. The mercy that had freed prisoners and lifted exiles turned to suspicion, cruelty, and a thirst for absolute power. Rome had prayed for his life, and in return, it received a ruler transformed. Caligula no longer saw himself as merely a man or even as an emperor. He began to speak and act as if he were divine. He ordered temples to be rededicated in his honor. Statues of Jupiter, the king of gods, were seized and reshaped to bear his likeness. He demanded not just loyalty but worship, commanding sacrifices to be made in his name. Senators and priests, once guardians of Rome's sacred traditions, were forced to bow, not before the immortal gods of their ancestors, but before the mortal who now sat upon the throne. The empire had crowned him Caesar. He now crowned himself a god. And from that moment, every act, every decree, every spectacle would be twisted by this delusion of divinity. Rome had long revered its rulers as favored by the gods. But now, for the first time, it was ruled by a man who believed he was one. The reign of Caligula, once heralded with joy, descended into a theater of cruelty and grotesque excess. What had begun as mercy and generosity curdled into a carnival of extravagance, humiliation, and blood. Rome had long known emperors who wielded power with severity, but now it faced something far more dangerous. A ruler who treated power as a game and the empire as his stage. His appetite for spectacle seemed without end. Games, feasts, and parades of staggering extravagance emptied the imperial treasury with breathtaking speed. Gold poured into his entertainments, not into the needs of Rome. And when the wealth of the state could no longer sustain his fantasies, he did not curb his indulgence. He turned upon his people. New and humiliating taxes were imposed. Nobles were stripped of their fortunes. Even gladiators, men whose blood already bought the amusement of the masses, were auctioned like property to refill his coffers. But it was not greed alone that marked Caligula's rule. It was cruelty, sharp, unpredictable, and theatrical. He delighted in executions, sometimes ordering them without warning, as though death itself were a diversion. Senators, once the guardians of Rome's dignity, were reduced to clowns for his amusement. Some were forced to run beside his chariot like slaves, others compelled to grovel at his feet in public humiliation. Most infamous of all was his mockery of the Senate's authority. His beloved horse, Incitatus, was housed in marble stables, fed oats mixed with gold flakes, and elevated to the rank of priest. Whispers spread that Caligula planned to make the animal consul, a cruel jest at the expense of Rome's ruling class, and a declaration that their dignity meant less to him than the hooves of his pet. Even his military campaigns became absurd performances. Marching his legions north, he led them not to conquest but to the shores of the English Channel. There, instead of battling foreign enemies, he ordered his soldiers to collect seashells, declaring them the spoils of victory over Neptune, god of the sea. What should have been a campaign of honor became a comedy of madness, a farce etched into the annals of empire. And yet, through all of this, Rome trembled not with rebellion but with awe. To some, Caligula's reckless power bore the mark of divinity, proof that he was more than mortal. To others, he was a living nightmare, a man who cloaked terror in laughter and treated the fate of the empire as a game. Rome was no longer ruled by a Caesar. It was ruled by a tyrant who fancied himself a god, and whose madness knew no boundaries. Rome could endure much: ambition, greed, even cruelty, but there were limits that even an empire built on power could not tolerate. For centuries, the strength of Rome rested upon a fragile balance. Emperors might rule as masters, but they were expected to preserve order, stability, and the illusion of justice. Caligula shattered that balance. His madness mocked the Senate, drained the treasury, insulted the legions, and desecrated the gods themselves. He had turned fear into his crown, and humiliation into his scepter. But fear breeds conspiracy, and humiliation demands revenge. By the winter of 41 AD, daggers were already being sharpened in the shadows of the Palatine. The conspirators were not distant enemies or rival generals. They were men of his own household guard, the Praetorians, sworn by oath to defend his life. Yet their loyalty, corroded by insult and terror, had finally broken. On a cold January day, fate struck. In the corridors of the palace, dimly lit by torches and echoing with the footfalls of conspirators, the emperor walked unaware that death waited in ambush. Then, in a sudden eruption of violence, steel flashed. The Praetorians fell upon him with their blades, and the man who had once been adored as Little Boots collapsed beneath the boots of his own soldiers. The fury did not end with him. His wife and young daughter, innocent in the storm of his making, were cut down as well, their blood mingling with his on the cold stone floor. In one ruthless stroke, not only the man but the line of Caligula was extinguished. Rome was stunned. The emperor who had dared to call himself a god had been struck down not by thunder from the heavens, but by the very hands pledged to guard him. His reign, so dazzling in its beginning, so horrifying in its fall, had lasted only 4 years. In the silence that followed, the empire drew its breath again, relieved, uncertain, and forever marked by the memory of the mad Caesar who had ruled like a god and died like a man.